The morning my daughter showed up at my front door after 12 years of silence, she wasn't alone. She had her husband beside her, a man I'd never once met in person, and behind them both was a boy with his eyes fixed on the ground and his shoulders hunched like he was trying to disappear inside his own skin. They had 4 large suitcases between them and 1 duffel bag that looked like it hadn't been zipped properly in years. My daughter was wearing a cream-colored wrap dress and heels that I knew immediately cost more than my first month's rent at my old apartment on Beatty's Ford Road. Her husband stood half a step behind her in a pressed linen shirt, smiling like a man who had practiced smiling in a mirror. I'm Claudia Faye Ellison. I'm 64 years old. I stood there in the doorway of my home in the Ballantyne neighborhood of Charlotte, North Carolina, holding a mug of Folgers that had gone lukewarm, and I said the one word I should not have said. Come in. But let me back up, because you need to understand who I was before that morning and what I'd spent 12 years building in the silence my daughter left behind. I was a hospital administrator at Carolina's Medical Center for 22 years. I started as a floor coordinator the year my daughter was born, worked my way up to department director, and in 2007 I left to start my own healthcare staffing consultancy. It was just me and a secondhand desk in a rented office on South Tryon Street at first. By the time I sold Ellison Healthcare Solutions in the spring of 2023, I had 41 employees, contracts in 9 states, and a buyer from Houston who paid me $3.8 million for a company I had built from scratch. During the years my own family was falling apart. My husband Robert died of a cardiac event in October 2011. He was 58 years old and coaching a middle school football game when it happened. The paramedics got there in 6 minutes. It didn't matter. He was gone before they could do anything. We'd been married for 31 years. My daughter was 26 when her father died. She'd been dating Pierce Calloway for 4 months. I know because I'd met him exactly once at a Sunday dinner 2 weeks before Robert passed, and I'd spent most of that dinner watching Pierce answer my questions about his work with just enough detail to sound credible and just enough vagueness to say nothing at all. He said he was in financial services. He said he worked with private clients. He had the kind of smile that reached his eyes, but never quite reached the lines around them. After Robert's funeral, my daughter and I argued. It wasn't the first time, and I knew it wouldn't be the last, but it was the one that cracked everything permanently. I'd mentioned, gently, that her husband had asked me twice that week about Robert's life insurance, and that I thought she should slow down with him, take some time to grieve before making decisions. She told me I was jealous of her happiness. She told me I'd always tried to control her. She said Pierce was the only person who truly understood her. 3 weeks later, she stopped returning my calls. A month after that, she changed her number. I found out they'd married in February 2012 from a cousin who saw the announcement on Facebook. I found out my grandson Micah had been born from my daughter's first relationship before Pierce through that same cousin, who sent me a photo in 2013 of a baby boy with Robert's forehead and my eyes. I printed that photo and kept it on my desk at the office for 10 years. I looked at it every morning before I started work and every evening before I turned off the lights. I grieved my daughter the way you grieve someone who chooses to leave, quietly, incrementally, in the spaces between work and sleep. And then I stopped grieving and I built something. Then I sold the company, bought a 4-bedroom house on Waverly Walk Court for $1.7 million, paid cash, and started trying to remember what it felt like to just breathe. I was sitting on my back patio the evening before they showed up, watching the sun drop behind the tree line, when my best friend Lena called. "You hear from your daughter lately?" "No," I said. "Why?" Lena was quiet a beat too long. "I ran into somebody from your old church who said they thought they saw your son-in-law on the news. Something about an insurance thing. I didn't want to say nothing if it was nothing. I told her I'd look into it. I didn't sleep well that night." The next morning, she was at my door with the suitcases. She looked tired underneath the dress and the makeup. Her eyes were doing that thing they'd always done when she was scared and didn't want me to see it, moving just a half second slower than the rest of her face, like her expression and her feelings were on a slight delay. I recognized it because I'd watched it my whole life. I just spent a long time trying to forget I knew it. "Mom," she said, her voice caught, "we're in trouble. Can we please come inside?" The boy, my grandson Micah, who was 13 and whom I had never once held in my arms, looked up at me when she said that, just for a second. His eyes were dark and wide, and he had a small healing cut on his lower lip that nobody mentioned and that I filed away immediately. I showed them to the guest rooms. My daughter and her husband took the larger one with the ensuite bath. I showed my grandson to the smaller room across the hall, the one with the window seat that looked out over the backyard, and when I told him he could put his things wherever he liked, he said, "Yes, ma'am." So quietly I almost didn't hear it. He didn't unpack. He sat on the edge of the bed with his duffel bag still zipped and his hands folded in his lap like he was waiting to be told what to do next. I made dinner that night. Baked chicken, collard greens, sweet potato casserole. Real food, the kind I hadn't cooked for company in longer than I could honestly remember. My daughter set the table without being asked. And her husband poured the sweet tea and said twice that the house was beautiful, that I must have really done well for myself, that it was just incredible what I'd accomplished. He said the word accomplished the way some men say it to older women, with just a thin thread of surprise running underneath it. Over dinner, the story came out in pieces. Her husband explained that he'd been running a boutique financial planning practice, high net worth clients, very selective. He explained that the regulatory environment had become difficult, that there were some complaints from former clients who hadn't understood the risks they'd agreed to, that the litigation was more of a nuisance than a genuine threat, but that the legal costs had become significant. He used the word nuisance 3 times. My daughter watched him talk the way someone watches a performance they've seen before, present but not quite there. I nodded. I asked clarifying questions that I already suspected the answers to. I let him fill the silence. After dinner, Micah helped me clear the table without being asked. When his stepfather went to take a phone call and my daughter stepped outside, I handed my grandson a dish towel and I said quietly, "How are you doing, baby?" He kept his eyes on the plate he was drying. "I'm okay." "That cut on your lip looks recent." He didn't answer for a moment, then I fell. I said, and I left it there for now. That night, after the house went quiet, I sat in my home office with the lights off and opened the app for my security system on my laptop. I'd had cameras installed in every common area of the house when I moved in. Living room, kitchen, hallways, front and back porch. I live alone in a large house. I am not naive about what that means. At 11:43, I watched my daughter and her husband come downstairs. The audio was clear. I'd paid for a good system. "She paid cash," her husband said. He was standing at my kitchen island, running his hand along the counter the way people do when they're calculating what something is worth. "Cash, Selena. You understand what that means?" "I know what it means," my daughter said. Her arms were crossed. She was looking out the window over the sink. "Her consultancy sold for almost $4 million. That's public record. Somebody in a sale that size doesn't put it all in one place." He paused. "We need access to what she's holding, liquid assets. Something we can move before February. She's not going to just give us. She doesn't have to give it to us. She just has to trust us enough to let us help her manage things. She's 64 and she's been alone for 2 years. She let us in the door, didn't she?" His voice dropped lower. "I've done this before. You find the account. You establish a pattern of trust. You get your name somewhere useful. It doesn't take long." My daughter was quiet for a long moment. "How much time do we have?" she asked. "The Fowler restitution is due to the federal court in February. If we don't have it by then, I'm looking at real time, not county. Federal." He set his glass on my counter. "So we don't have long." I closed the laptop. I sat in the dark for a long time with my hands very still in my lap. At 2:17 in the morning, there was a knock at my bedroom door. Micah stood in the hallway in basketball shorts and a t-shirt 2 sizes too big, his arms wrapped around himself. I sat him down on the small settee near my window and gave him the spare blanket from the foot of my bed. He held it without unfolding it. "I heard them talking on the drive here," he said, "before, about you." He stopped, gathered himself. "Stepdad has done this before. He moved in with an older woman in Greensboro about 3 years ago, a friend of my mom's. He was nice to her for a few months, and then he got her to put him on her bank account because she was having trouble with her vision and needed help. And then one day a lot of her money was just gone." He looked at me. "She didn't press charges. I heard him tell Mom that if it worked once it would work again." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. He blinked like the question surprised him. "Because you're my grandmother," he said simply. "And because I'm tired." He swallowed. "I'm tired of watching him do things and nobody saying anything." I reached over and took his hand. His knuckles were thin and his nails were bitten down to the quick. "Is he hurting you?" I asked directly. He looked at the window. Then he nodded, just once. "Not bad. He doesn't hit me, but he gets close. He gets loud. He broke my phone once and said it was an accident." The cut on his lip caught the moonlight from the window. I told him that he was safe in my house. I meant it the way I'd meant very few things in my life, all the way down, no conditions attached. I told him I needed him to go back to bed and act like everything was normal, that I had a plan, that I needed a few days. He looked at me the same way children look at adults when they're deciding whether or not to believe them. Then he nodded, tucked the blanket under his arm, and went back across the hall. I called Lena before sunrise. I told her everything, the camera footage, what my grandson had said. I needed her to come by that afternoon, ostensibly to drop off food, and to leave a bank statement on my kitchen table in a way that looked accidental, not my real accounts, a secondary checking account I used for household expenses. Balance, $44,000. Enough to look like it might be the surface of something larger, enough to make a greedy man get careless. "Lord have mercy," Lena said. "Can you do it?" "You know I can." By Thursday, I had a meeting with my attorney, Camille Pryor, who I'd used since the early days of my consultancy. She was 51, sharp and no nonsense, and she didn't blink once during the 40 minutes it took me to walk her through everything. She typed the name Pierce Calloway into her system. 20 minutes later, she turned the laptop toward me. His legal name was Pierce Allen Whitmore. He had changed his surname in 2009, 2 years after a civil judgment in Cuyahoga County, Ohio, where a retired schoolteacher named Hilda Fowler had won a $94,000 default judgment against him for misappropriating her retirement savings. The judgment had never been collected because he'd moved to Tennessee. There was a second complaint in Columbus in 2015, a former client who reported him to the State Department of Insurance for operating without a current license. A third case in Greensboro, North Carolina, settled privately. 15 years. He had been doing this for 15 years. He moves states when the pressure builds, Camille said. Classic predatory pattern. I sat with that for a moment. My daughter had been with this man for 12 of those 15 years. "Can you protect my assets without alerting him?" "Already handled," Camille said. She pushed a document across the desk. "Your primary holdings are structured through a revocable trust in your name only. He cannot access $1 of it without your signature on a document you will never sign." She folded her hands. "What else do you need?" "I need you to come to a dinner I'm hosting next Saturday," I said. "Bring everything you just showed me." I played the part they expected in the days that followed. I let her husband walk me through a yellow legal pad full of financial advice he'd drafted at my kitchen table. I let him explain compound interest to me, like I was a woman who'd never read a balance sheet. I said things like I never was much good with numbers, a sentence I have never once said in my life. And I watched his eyes light up the way eyes do when a person thinks they've located a door that's easier to open than they expected. My daughter watched. She almost never spoke during those sessions. On Wednesday evening, while her husband was out running what he called an errand, I told my daughter I needed help finding something in the cabinet above the refrigerator. When she came into the kitchen, I closed the door. "I know who he is," I said. She went completely still. I set Camille's folder on the counter between us. "I've known for 4 days, Hilda Fowler, Greensboro, Akron, the name he was born with." I waited. "I'm giving you the chance to tell me your side of it before this goes any further." My daughter's face did something I had no name for. She sat down on the kitchen stool and she stared at the folder without opening it. "I've been trying to leave him for 2 years, she said. Her voice was flat, not apologetic, just exhausted. "He controls everything. The bank accounts, the lease, both cars, everything is in his name. I have nothing that's mine." She looked up. I didn't know the full history. "He told me Ohio was a misunderstanding, that the woman was unstable. I wanted to believe him." She paused. "For a long time I chose to believe him. And now..." She met my eyes for the first time since she'd walked through my door. "I'm scared of him, Mom." The word landed between us like something fragile. He will not touch you or your son in this house, I said. I promise you that. But I need something from you in return. I need you to trust me and let me handle this my way. And when it's over, and it will be over soon, we are going to sit down together and have a very long conversation about 12 years, about your choices, and about what I have to decide about all of that. I held her gaze steady. I'm not offering you a free pass. I'm offering you a way through. Can you agree to that? She was crying by then, quietly, the way she'd always cried when she was genuinely ashamed of something, rather than just frustrated. She nodded. Go wash your face, I said. He'll be home within the hour. The dinner was the following Saturday. I called it a homecoming, a small gathering to welcome my daughter back and introduced her to my community in Charlotte. My church family, neighbors from the street, Lena's people, several former colleagues who'd known me for decades. 32 guests in total. Camille arrived 40 minutes early. So did a licensed social worker named Denise from Mecklenburg County Family Services, whom I'd contacted on Thursday about the procedures for emergency protective placement of a minor. So did 2 officers from Charlotte Mecklenburg Police, who were waiting in the den off the hallway with the door pulled partway closed. I had cooked for 2 days. The table was set with my good china and the linen napkins Robert had bought me for our 25th anniversary. My daughter helped me arrange everything without being asked. And she was steady, steadier than I expected. And I felt something move in my chest watching her fold the napkins the way I'd shown her when she was 9 years old. Her husband was charming at dinner. He always was. He made a toast to family coming back together, and he looked at me across the table with that practiced warmth, and I smiled back. And I let him believe he was winning right up until the moment I stood up at 8 o'clock and walked to the front of the room. I thanked everyone for coming. I said I had something I needed to share, something I'd been sitting with for the past week, and that I'd always believed in doing hard things in the presence of community rather than alone. Then I set Camille's folder on the table, and I simply told the truth. I told it piece by piece, his real name, Ohio, Hilda Fowler and her retirement savings and the judgment that followed him across state lines. The pattern, Columbus, Greensboro, Charlotte. I explained what I had heard on the security cameras, and Camille confirmed the recordings existed and were legally obtained. I told them about the cut on my grandson's lip and the shattered phone, and the things that boy had been carrying around in silence with nobody to tell. I didn't perform any of it. I just spoke plainly, because the truth doesn't need staging. Her husband stood up when I reached Ohio. These are fabrications, he said. His voice was still controlled, barely. This is a confused old woman who, Selena, tell them. She's been mixing up her medications. She gets turned around. This is not. My name is Claudia, I said. You have had 2 weeks to learn it. Camille slid a document across the table to the officer who'd stepped into the room. I watched her husband read it. I watched him understand what it was. He moved toward the hallway. He made it as far as the foyer. He did not make it to the front door. My daughter didn't cry when they put the handcuffs on him. She sat in her chair with her hands folded in her lap, and my grandson, who had slipped from his seat at some point and come to stand quietly behind her, put his hand on her shoulder. She reached up and covered his hand with both of hers. It was the first time I had ever seen them touch like that. The first time I'd seen her reach for him first. The charges were wire fraud, consumer financial fraud, and obstruction of a prior court order. Camille had already been in contact with the Ohio Attorney General's office, which had been looking for Pierce Whitmore for 3 years. He was denied bail. My daughter stayed. I want to be careful about how I say what came next, because I know what people want to hear, and I know what actually happened, and those 2 things are not the same. She stayed, and we talked, and some of those conversations were very hard, and I went to bed after some of them without speaking to her for the rest of the evening. She had made choices, not just about who she married, but about Micah, about us, about what she'd allowed herself to know, and what she'd chosen not to look at directly. I told her all of that. I didn't soften it or take it back. She had to hear it. And she listened, really listened, in a way she hadn't been capable of at 26. And I think that was the only reason we were able to stay in the same house through February and into spring without one of us breaking completely. She was not forgiven quickly. I want to be clear about that. Forgiveness is not a switch. It is a long process undertaken mostly in private, mostly when you're doing something ordinary like washing dishes or driving to the grocery store, and it doesn't announce itself. It just slowly takes up less room. Micah started at a middle school 3 miles from my house in January. He joined the chess club, which surprised no one who had spent 10 minutes with him. He asked me in February if he could plant something in the backyard. On a cold Saturday morning, we went to the Lowe's on Pineville Matthews Road and bought sunflower seeds and a flat of snap peas and a small rosemary bush because he'd read somewhere that rosemary was good for memory. I didn't tell him that I'd read the same thing once, about 30 years ago, when Robert and I were learning to garden together in the backyard of our first house. My daughter got a job in March. Medical billing, she'd done coding work years ago and picked it back up fast. She enrolled in a paralegal certification course at CPCC on Tuesday evenings. She didn't ask me to pay for it. That mattered to me more than she'll ever know. There are still mornings when I sit on the back patio with my coffee, and I feel the weight of the years I spent in that particular silence. 12 years. Every birthday of Micah's that came and went without me. Every ordinary Tuesday morning that belonged to some other version of this family that I never got to live inside. But then the back door opens and my grandson comes out in his socks with a bowl of cereal, and he sits on the step below my chair, and he asks me what kind of bird that is, the one on the fence post. And I tell him it's a Carolina wren. They're everywhere down here. And he says he thought it might be a sparrow, and I tell him no, a sparrow sits differently. And we sit in the early morning light disagreeing about birds while the rosemary comes in strong, and the first sunflowers push up out of the dark soil toward wherever the light is coming from. I'm 64 years old. I spent a long time being invisible to the people who should have seen me most clearly. They thought age made me soft. They thought loneliness made me desperate. They thought a woman who had been waiting 12 years for her family to come home would sign anything, believe anything, hand over anything just to keep the door open. They were wrong about all of it. But the thing they got most wrong wasn't my bank accounts or my security cameras or my attorney. The thing they got most wrong was why I let them in. I let them in because of a 13-year-old boy with a healing cut on his lip who looked up at me in my doorway and said nothing and didn't have to. I let them in because I had spent 12 years looking at a photograph on my desk, and I was not willing to let fear be the reason I stopped fighting for what I love. It took handcuffs and 32 witnesses and a very long winter to get to where we are now. But we are here, and this time nobody is leaving.